We also learned more today about the FBI's secret files on Marilyn Monroe. They reveal some of her friends were suspected communists, and she once considered traveling to the Soviet Union. The FBI kept files on her from 1955 until her death in 1962.
She wasn't a starlet or a studio head. She wasn't a journalist or a detective. But Eunice Murray may have been the only person truly inside Marilyn Monroe's world during her final moments. As Monroe's live-in housekeeper and personal assistant, Eunice was present the night Hollywood's brightest icon died. And for decades, she kept her silence. Until, late in life, she finally began to talk. For years, her name lingered on the edge of the Monroe tragedy, often dismissed as a background figure. But Eunice saw more than anyone ever realized. She knew Marilyn's routines, her shifting moods, her fragile habits. She knew when the house was quiet for the wrong reasons, and when the lights stayed on longer than they should have. In the early 1980s, after decades of avoiding the press, Eunice began to open up in scattered interviews, on radio, in books, and once, during a short televised appearance that left viewers stunned. She didn't yell or dramatize, but her quiet tone hinted at something far more complicated than the public had ever been told. She was alone, Eunice once said, but she didn't die alone. That quote would come to haunt historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Because if Marilyn didn't die alone, who was with her? Eunice had worked for Monroe through years of ups and downs. She'd seen the actress at her most joyful and her most broken. She had been there after late-night fights, studio meltdowns, and whispered phone calls that came in after midnight. In some ways, she was more than a housekeeper. She was a quiet witness to the unraveling of a legend. For most of her life, she said little. The official story was clear. Monroe died of a barbiturate overdose on August 5, 1962. A tragic accident. A troubled star gone too soon. But to Eunice, that version of events never felt complete. And once she started talking, the cracks began to show. Over time, her testimony has become one of the most puzzling and essential threads in the mystery surrounding Monroe's death. Some dismissed her as confused or contradictory. Others believed she had been pressured to keep the full truth hidden. But no matter where one stands, one fact remains chillingly clear. Eunice Murray was there. And in her final years, she told a story that would change everything we thought we knew. The night Marilyn died. When Eunice Murray began to feel something was wrong. She'd worked in Marilyn's home for years by then, but that night had a stillness that didn't sit right. It was too quiet, too staged, too final. Marilyn had locked herself in her bedroom earlier in the evening. That wasn't unusual, but by 3 a.m., the light under the door was still glowing, and Marilyn still hadn't responded to any knocks. Eunice began to panic. "I just knew," she said years later. "Something had shifted." That's when she called Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist and frequent visitor. Greenson arrived quickly. He sensed the same unease. He called out to Marilyn through the door. No answer. Then, with urgency, he smashed a window and climbed inside. What he saw would become one of the most enduring images in Hollywood tragedy. Marilyn Monroe, face down on her bed, a phone in one hand, unmoving. She was nude, lifeless, surrounded by neatly arranged pill bottles. Her body was still warm, but she was gone. Police were called. Reporters would soon follow. By morning, the world would wake to the news that its most beloved icon was dead at 36. The official verdict: probable suicide due to overdose. But Eunice saw something different that night. She later described how strange the room felt, how nothing looked out of place, how the bed had been made, even though a dead woman was lying on top of it. The nightstand held dozens of pills, but there was no water glass nearby. Marilyn had allegedly swallowed a lethal dose of barbiturates, yet there was no sign of how. Something wasn't right. And in Eunice's voice, even decades later, the doubt still lingered. "I felt like I was in a movie," she once said, like the script had already been written. The scene that unfolded in that Brentwood home that night remains the stuff of legend, speculation, and endless contradiction. But for Eunice, it wasn't about conspiracy or cover-up. It was about what she saw, and what she felt, and most of all, what didn't make sense. The famous phone call. Of all the mysteries surrounding Marilyn Monroe's final hours, none has sparked more speculation than the phone call Eunice claimed to overhear shortly before the tragedy unfolded. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't friendly. And whoever was on the other end, Marilyn was furious. "I remember her shouting," Eunice said in a late interview. She said, "Don't lie to me again." That's the moment I knew. Something was off. The call took place just hours before her death. Some believe it was Bobby Kennedy. Others suggest it was a high-ranking studio executive or even an intelligence official. But the caller's identity has never been confirmed. There's no official phone record, no witness other than Eunice. But the tension, she remembered that well. Marilyn had been in a strange mood that day, and the call seemed to push her over an invisible edge. After hanging up, she went silent. She withdrew to her room and didn't come out again. Eunice didn't know the full content of the call, but the tone? It was unmistakable. Something had been said, something that broke trust. Marilyn's voice, usually soft and slow, had risen with rage. She wasn't begging. She was accusing. She sounded like someone who'd just realized everything she believed had been a lie, Eunice said. This one phone call, though undocumented, has fueled decades of speculation. Was it related to Marilyn's alleged affairs with the Kennedy brothers? Did she threaten to go public with something? Was she warned or silenced? One chilling theory suggests the call was not just a fight, but a warning. That Marilyn's death wasn't an accident, but a message. And if that's true, the last person to hear her voice in that moment wasn't a lover or a doctor. It was her housekeeper, the woman who listened through the door, who heard the last flicker of defiance in a voice about to go dark. The call was never logged. The caller never came forward. But Eunice never forgot it. The bedroom was cleaned. When police finally arrived at Marilyn Monroe's home, what they saw didn't look like a crisis scene. It looked orderly, too orderly. The bed was made. The pill bottles were lined up in neat rows. Nothing looked chaotic. Nothing looked desperate. That detail still bothers experts today. Eunice Murray later admitted, in one of her most haunting revelations, that some tidying had taken place before the authorities arrived. She didn't go into detail. She didn't say who gave the order. But she acknowledged that the room had been straightened up. "We wanted things to look peaceful," she said once. Like she went quietly. But the implications of that are huge. If someone altered the room, moved items, made the bed, even arranged pills, then the scene police investigated wasn't the original scene. It was a version of it. A version someone wanted them to see. That has fed into countless theories over the decades. Was Marilyn's death staged to look like suicide? Was it actually a murder, carefully dressed in tragedy? Eunice never said those words, but her actions, admitting the room was altered, spoke volumes. Crime scene analysts have long pointed out that the staging didn't make sense. The bed being made, yet her body lying on top, was contradictory. The lack of a water glass, the perfectly placed pill bottles. Nothing matched the behavior of someone in distress. And perhaps the most chilling part? No one ever asked her who helped straighten the room. No one wanted to know. A mysterious visitor. Eunice Murray didn't recognize the man at the door that afternoon, but she remembered him vividly. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in a pressed suit, he appeared sometime after lunch on August 4th, 1962. He didn't offer a name. He didn't wait long. And once he left, Marilyn Monroe began to cry. He was serious, Eunice recalled. Polished and impatient. She never heard his voice, only saw the exchange through the hallway. Marilyn had come out of her bedroom, walked to the door, and spoke with him quietly for less than 5 minutes. When the door closed behind him, something changed in her. Eunice described it as an emotional collapse. She didn't say what he told her, she later said. But whatever it was, it crushed her. No records of the visit exist. No logs, no phone calls, no eyewitnesses except Eunice. Yet, for decades, this mysterious man has become one of the key threads in conspiracy theories surrounding Monroe's death. Some believe he was a government agent. Others insist he was a Kennedy associate sent to retrieve documents or deliver a message. And a few believe he came not to warn, but to threaten. Eunice didn't speculate publicly, but when asked if she believed the man was connected to Monroe's eventual death, she only said, after he left, she was no longer Marilyn. That visit remains one of the most puzzling and unnerving aspects of her final day. Because whatever was said during those 5 quiet minutes, it stayed with Marilyn until the end. And it left Eunice with the sinking feeling that the tragedy hadn't just started that night. It had begun that afternoon, when a man with no name stepped into their lives and took something with him when he left. Conflicting stories from Greenson. When Marilyn Monroe died, the first people questioned weren't detectives, they were doctors. And at the center of that medical circle was Dr. Ralph Greenson, Monroe's personal psychiatrist and one of the last people to see her alive. His account of that day was detailed, polished, and, according to Eunice Murray, not entirely true. Greenson claimed that when he visited Marilyn on August 4th, she had been in good spirits, calm, engaged. They spoke for nearly an hour. He said she seemed better than she had in weeks, but Eunice's version of the day told a different story. She barely left her room, Eunice recalled. She was quiet, withdrawn. She cried more than she talked. She remembered seeing Marilyn sitting in the hallway at one point, knees pulled to her chest, face hidden in her arms. That image stayed with her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was hopelessly childlike. She wasn't in good spirits, Eunice insisted. She was lost. Why would Greenson say otherwise? That's the question that's lingered ever since. Was he trying to protect Marilyn's legacy, or was he protecting himself? Because Greenson wasn't just a psychiatrist, he had access to every corner of Marilyn's life. Her medications, her mental state, her secrets. And when his version of the timeline clashed with Eunice's, it wasn't just about memory, it was about truth. Some believe Greenson was part of a coordinated effort to reshape the events of that day, that Marilyn's real condition, her real despair, was scrubbed from the record to maintain the narrative of overdose rather than something more complicated. Eunice never accused him outright, but she made one thing painfully clear. Our memories didn't match, and mine came from watching her all day. The tapes and the diary. One of the most persistent myths about Marilyn Monroe's final days is that she was keeping a red diary. Not a prop, not a personal journal, but a vault of secrets, names, phone numbers, and conversations that tied her to the world's most powerful men. And according to Eunice Murray, it wasn't a myth at all. "I saw it," she said in a rare 1985 interview, "on her nightstand, days before she died." Eunice described it as small, leather-bound, with red stitching. Marilyn often scribbled in it after phone calls, sometimes with a smile, sometimes in frustration. She never left it lying around unless she was home alone. It was her insurance, or so she hinted to friends. But after her death, the diary vanished. Police never logged it. No photos show it. No entry lists it among Monroe's personal effects. But those who knew her, including a few former friends, confirmed that she often spoke of keeping records just in case. Theories around the red diary are endless. Some say it included details of Monroe's alleged affair with both Kennedy brothers. Others claim it had information on FBI surveillance or phone taps. A few believe it was a blend of gossip and paranoia. Nothing concrete, but dangerous nonetheless. Eunice didn't know what was inside. She only knew it was gone. When asked where she thought it went, she said quietly, "It wasn't there when the police arrived, but it was there the day before." That gap between presence and absence has launched decades of speculation. Did someone take it that night? Was it destroyed? Or locked away, somewhere deep inside a government archive? One thing is clear. If the diary existed, it held truths Monroe wasn't ready to share aloud. And Eunice? She was the last person who saw it. Marilyn's fear of surveillance. She was America's most famous woman. But behind the beauty, beyond the spotlight, Marilyn Monroe lived in fear, not of fans or photographers, but of something far darker. "They're listening to everything," Eunice once overheard her say. It sounded like paranoia, like the kind of fear whispered by someone unraveling. But after her death, those fears were proven true. FBI files later revealed Monroe's home had been wiretapped, her phones monitored by both government investigators and private detectives hired by jealous lovers and political rivals. She wasn't imagining things. She was being watched. Eunice remembered the signs: strange clicks on the phone, electrical hums when the house was quiet. Marilyn had even told her, "Don't say names on the line. They're listening." At the time, Eunice dismissed it as Hollywood anxiety. But now, it feels like a warning. The surveillance wasn't just federal. According to declassified files, private detectives hired by studio executives and possibly even organized crime figures had placed taps throughout Monroe's property. She had become a woman surrounded by shadows, where every word spoken could end up in the wrong hands, and she knew it. Eunice recalled Marilyn once holding the phone with the cord ripped out of the wall. "I don't trust anything anymore," she said. After her death, technicians found evidence of unauthorized devices in her home wiring. Devices not installed by the phone company. Was it the Kennedys? The FBI? A jealous ex? Eunice never speculated. But the fear in Marilyn's eyes was something she would never forget. Marilyn's final words. It wasn't a grand goodbye. It wasn't even clear at the time. But looking back, Eunice Murray couldn't shake the weight of Marilyn's final words. Earlier that evening, before the bedroom door closed for the last time, Marilyn turned to Eunice and said something quiet, almost whispered, "Say goodbye to the world for me." At the time, Eunice brushed it off as just another dramatic remark. Marilyn was known for her moods. waves of sadness and self-reflection that came and went like weather. But this felt different. There was something behind her voice that night, something distant, final. She wasn't sad, Eunice said later. She was already gone. That moment, that one line, would come back to haunt her. Because in retrospect, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like resignation. Eunice said Marilyn had spent the day disconnected, repeating herself, asking questions about non-existent appointments, refusing to take calls. It was like she was winding down, removing herself from the world one layer at a time. She was saying goodbye before anyone noticed. What's chilling is the ambiguity. Were those words a suicide note in spoken form, or a reaction to something she feared was coming? Some, including Eunice, wondered if Marilyn had been warned, if that strange visitor or the phone call earlier that day had been more than stress. Maybe she didn't choose death. Maybe she expected it. She didn't seem like someone planning an escape, Eunice said. She seemed like someone being led to it. There's no recording of that conversation, no diary entry, just a memory, recalled years later by the only living witness. But sometimes, the simplest words hold the loudest meaning. And for Eunice Murray, "Say goodbye to the world for me" became the moment that Marilyn Monroe stopped being a star and became a ghost. What Eunice was told not to say. After Marilyn Monroe was pronounced dead, police questioned everyone at the house. But according to Eunice Murray, it wasn't the detectives who frightened her. It was the call she received after they left. "Don't speak to the press." That was all the voice said. No name, no explanation, just a warning. Direct, clear, and enough to make her go silent. Within hours, Eunice disappeared. Friends said she went to stay with family in Pasadena. Reporters tried to find her for statements, but she wasn't answering the phone. She returned days later, visibly shaken and absolutely unwilling to speak. She looked terrified, one neighbor recalled, like she had seen something she couldn't unsee. Eunice wouldn't give interviews, wouldn't answer follow-ups from the LAPD, wouldn't even talk to friends about what she had witnessed. For years, her silence was seen as guilt or confusion. But decades later, she finally admitted the truth. "I was told to stay quiet," she said. "For everyone's sake." Who told her? She never said. But that phrase, "everyone's sake," implied something bigger than embarrassment. It implied danger, power, possibly protection of names that couldn't be printed. And the strange thing, no one ever followed up. No subpoenas, no public demands. It was as if the world quietly accepted the idea that Marilyn Monroe's death didn't need revisiting. But Eunice remembered, and in the private corners of her life, it haunted her. Because she wasn't just keeping secrets, she was guarding a moment in history that no one else could tell. The day she broke her silence, for more than 20 years, Eunice Murray lived in quiet avoidance. She refused interviews, declined book deals, and rarely spoke of Marilyn Monroe. But in the mid-1980s, something changed. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was regret. But she finally agreed to an interview. And what she said shook everything. Marilyn did not die alone. That was the first thing she said, softly but firmly. And in those 6 words, the entire myth of Marilyn's lonely overdose began to unravel. Eunice went on to say there were people in that house that night, people who didn't belong. She didn't name names, didn't elaborate, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. The interviewer pressed gently. Was it family? Doctors? Strangers? Eunice wouldn't say. but her hands trembled as she described watching things unfold, watching people arrive, watching Marilyn close the door one final time, and then watching the cleanup begin. "She didn't die in peace," Eunice whispered. "She died in confusion." The interview made headlines briefly, but was dismissed by many as the ramblings of an aging woman. But conspiracy researchers, biographers, and even former law enforcement began to take notice. Because parts of her story matched new revelations in declassified documents. And her tone, it wasn't dramatic. It was broken, worn. "I stayed quiet too long," she said, "but I can't take it with me." It was the first time someone who had been inside that house told the public that Marilyn Monroe's death may not have been what it seemed. And for many, that was all the confirmation they ever needed. The press didn't believe her at first. When Eunice Murray finally broke her silence decades after Marilyn Monroe's death, the press didn't greet her with interest or compassion. They mocked her. Her name, once a footnote in the tragedy, was now splashed across tabloids. But not with reverence, with ridicule. Housekeeper's wild claims reignite Monroe mystery, one paper blared in thick black print. Another headline accused her of attention-seeking. Desperate for the spotlight? Even mainstream outlets treated her like a curiosity rather than a witness. The implication was clear. This old woman was trying to stir ghosts for fame. But the world wasn't the same as it had been in 1962. The 1980s and 90s saw the beginning of a cultural shift. Journalists were starting to dig deeper into Hollywood's golden age, not for glamour, but for the truth behind it. Declassified government documents were surfacing. Investigative reporters were pulling threads that had once been carefully hidden. And that's when Eunice's words began to sound less far-fetched. One FBI file confirmed that Marilyn's home phone had indeed been tapped, matching Eunice's decades-old claim that Monroe believed she was being listened to. Another report confirmed that Monroe had been under constant surveillance by private investigators, political operatives, and even studio security. LAPD documents surfaced that referenced timeline discrepancies in the statements of Monroe's inner circle, especially psychiatrist Ralph Greenson, a detail Eunice had been pointing out for years. Suddenly, her testimony no longer seemed like the ramblings of a confused elderly woman. It started to sound like the first draft of something buried too long. A group of independent researchers in the late 1990s reopened the Monroe case unofficially. They interviewed retired police officers, studio insiders, and journalists. But the person they returned to again and again was Eunice Murray. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had something irreplaceable: memory. She wasn't always consistent, one researcher admitted. But she was honest. You could feel it. Her pain wasn't rehearsed. It was embedded. Some theorized that her inconsistencies were the result of trauma, not fabrication, that she had been pressured into silence, coached into forgetting, and then left to carry the shame of knowing too much and being believed by no one. But slowly, the tide turned. Documentaries began including her quotes without irony. Biographers, serious ones, began citing her timeline. And eventually, major publications started referring to her not as a fringe voice, but as the sole civilian eyewitness to Monroe's final hours. The woman who had once stood unseen in the background of Marilyn's life was now seen as crucial to understanding her death. Time didn't erase Eunice Murray's credibility. It revealed it. What her story really reveals. Eunice Murray never wanted to be part of history. But when Marilyn Monroe died in that quiet Brentwood home, Eunice became the last living thread to the truth, and she carried that burden alone. Her story, fragmented, emotional, incomplete, isn't just about what happened to Marilyn. It's about what fame doesn't protect you from. It's about loneliness, secrets, fear, and the weight of silence. Marilyn wasn't just the blonde bombshell. She was a woman tangled in the politics of men, the pressures of power, and the chaos of being too visible in a world that wanted her voiceless. Through Eunice, we saw the cracks, the forgotten calls, the cleaned room, the diary that vanished, the visitor who arrived without a name, and finally, the housekeeper who kept it all in for decades. Whether Monroe died by her own hand or not, one thing is clear. She was not at peace in her final hours. She needed protection, Eunice once said. But no one protected her. Not really. And maybe that's what hurts the most. That even in the house she paid for, surrounded by people who knew her, Marilyn died as if she were already a ghost. Eunice's story is not just a confession. It's a eulogy for truth, for memory, and for a woman the world thought they understood, until the woman who cleaned her home told us. Otherwise, Eunice Murray wasn't a star, but she held the final thread in Marilyn Monroe's tragic story. Her quiet truths, once ignored, now echo louder than ever. Whether it was suicide, sabotage, or something more sinister, one thing is clear. Marilyn didn't leave this world unnoticed. Someone was watching, and Eunice remembered.